All right. Well, good afternoon. I'm Jonathan Geyer, Managing Editor of the American Prospect. Today, we're going to be launching our January-February issue, Democrats and Government Together Again. This is our 7th issue put to bed totally remotely in lockdown, thanks to our incredible team of editors, writers, fact checkers, and interns. And today, we're going to be talking about the movement that elected Joe Biden, lessons learned from 2012, 2016, and now 2020, what happened on Jan 6th, not just the insurrection, but also the momentous Democratic win in Atlanta. But we're going to start off the conversation with our staff writer, Alexander Sammon, who's written a great feature, a set of Q&As in this issue on the new squad, the new progressives that have taken over Capitol Hill, what we're calling the class of 2020. So Alex, can you introduce us to the new squad? Tell us about some of these names and some of these players.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Jonathan. So I think, in this freshman class, obviously for Democrats in the House, things didn't go that well in 2020, and Democrats lost a number of seats that they expected to win, and they ended up, ceding quite a few seats to Republicans. But on the progressive side of the operation, there were 4 seats in particular where we saw really strong progressives win election and kind of announce themselves in the Democratic caucus and in Congress broadly as real advocates of kind of the left wing agenda in some of these major policy priorities. And those are Marie Newman in Illinois, Mondaire Jones in New York, Jamal Bowman also in New York, and Cori Bush in Missouri. So the 4 of them have kind of been the most vocal advocates of major progressive policy priorities in the House, and even in just a couple of weeks, they've already shown how they're going to influence the agenda in Washington and kind of what kind of things they bring to the Hill that the Democrats were lacking before that.
Well, some of these guys are political outsiders, right? Cori Bush was a Black Lives Matter activist. Jamal Bowman was a educator and a principal in New York. What is the new kind of character, the new perspective that they're bringing to the Hill at this moment?
Yeah, it's a really good point. Both Jamal and Cori have really robust backgrounds as activists, and both Mondaire and Marie as well are representatives who have a close proximity to social movements, to grassroots organizations, and to organizing. And that's something that we haven't really seen in Democrats broadly. It's something, the relationship between these activist groups and organizing and the party has gone back and forth over the years. And in this group, we have representatives who are closely aligned with social movements, maybe closer than with those groups than with the party, and they kind of bring that both that perspective, but also that strategy to the Hill. And that's something, again, that hasn't been a big part of the Democratic caucus in the House, is using social movements to get your agenda across the finish line. And those things I think are really important. And we've already kind of seen the way these representatives have different strategies and can be actually quite fearless compared to some of the kind of progressive Democrats of years gone by.
And on policy, I mean, what are the issues that this new group, the new squad, really cares about?
Well, they're the kind of top billed agenda priorities are obviously Medicare for all, their Green New Deal, $15 minimum wage, and quickly we've seen how $15 minimum wage is part of this first package that Biden's put together, and that I think is a pretty stunning accomplishment, something that wouldn't have happened without a kind of swelling ranks of progressives in the House, and so I think we see their presence there. I think we also see it even in things with the impeachment trial, and in the wake of that insurrection on January 6th, some of the most vocal representatives from the get-go about, first of all, impeaching Trump, and second of all, handing down consequences to Republican Congress people who wanted to throw out the election result. Those were these representatives. So that was Cori Bush, that was Jamal Bowman, that was Marie Newman and Mondaire Jones, who were right out the gate endorsing these measures, while other Democrats were taking a much more cautious tack. And so those are all things I think meaningful differences we've already seen just in a handful of weeks.
Yeah, walk us through that. You had a great piece on our website that kind of gave us a tick-tock of what was happening with this group of new legislators on January 6th. So Cori Bush was really ahead of the game in terms of calling for impeachment. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And also in terms of expelling Republican members of Congress who voted to overturn the election result. And so that's the sort of thing where, you know, Democrats have been pretty squeamish about that sort of thing, about, you know, wielding power, about enacting consequences, or seeing through accountability. And you know, this group doesn't have any of that. There's no holding back on those sorts of things. And so, yeah, Cori was one of the first ones out of the gate on that, and really set the tone. And I think she forced Democrats to fall in line with her. So even as someone who'd been in office for, you know, at that point 3 days, was already setting the agenda. And I think if you're a progressive, that's extremely promising to see that, you know, someone with no seniority really taking the reins and leading the party.
Were there other hints in your kind of Q&As with these new lawmakers that kind of gave you inspiration or got you excited about what they represent in this particular political moment?
Yeah, I think that, you know, I think it's useful to think of them as a class, and the way we think of the squad, but also they kind of individually have their own priorities. And it was nice to kind of talk to each one and see what those priorities are. And I think as you talk to them individually, you get a sense that they do all, you know, co-sign these major progressive agenda items that we've talked about here in the last few minutes, but they also really care about things like infrastructure or education, or, you know, democracy reforms. And those sorts of things are also extremely important. And those are probably the places where, you know, having tireless advocates like that working on those committees, those are, you know, you're going to see changes in those areas as well that are going to be, you know, kind of less headline grabbing, but I think are going to be very important. And I think, you know, as you kind of read through these Q&As, you'll see where the energy is going, where the priorities are, and I think it's kind of heartening to see this broad progressive vision kind of brought to bear on very specific parts of policy and legislation. And it'll be interesting to track kind of going forward through this session how much of that gets passed into law or you know, becomes reality.
And in our last 2 minutes with you, Alex, look, the pandemic has just laid bare so much inequality. I think the anti-racism movement of last summer showed inequity throughout every level of society. Do you think this new group of lawmakers, this new squad, you know, is going to take this head on? Are they going to clash with Nancy Pelosi? Are they going to clash with Schumer? What do you expect in the next period?
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see just how much they do. I think from the conversations I've had with people who work on the Hill, the first word that comes up when talking about people like Cori Bush or Jamal Bowman is fearlessness. So I don't think they're going to shy away from any of these battles. I think those two in particular have really taken up the mantle of racial justice in a meaningful way. My conversation with Jamal Bowman really focused a lot on reparations as a political project, which is something that obviously Democratic Party has not wanted to touch. No one's wanted to touch really in any meaningful way. And he's been a very vocal and unapologetic advocate for that. And Cori Bush as well. Obviously, her bona fides as a racial justice advocate need no introduction. And I think that you're going to see, you know, a group that is that's motivated, extremely motivated, and willing to take on, you know, not just corporate interests, not just the Republican Party, but also Democratic leadership in the interest of these things. And I think, again, if you're a progressive, that's a pretty exciting thing to think about going into this session.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Alex. This is Alexander Sammon, our staff writer. Tune in to prospect.org, where he's regularly contributing on these new progressive lawmakers who are making a huge difference in Congress just in their first few days. Definitely check out that report on what they were up to on January 6th amid the insurrection, when Representative Cori Bush is already talking about accountability for lawmakers participating in what is very clearly sedition. So thank you, Alex, for all your reporting on this.
Thanks so much, Jonathan.
Okay, now we're going to kind of go on the other end of the January 6th angle and talk about the Democratic victory in Georgia. We actually had two reporters there, Brittany Gibson, our writing fellow, Eli Day, who we sent down thanks to your support, thanks to our contributors. Eli is an investigative journalist, a Detroit native. Brittany Gibson is our writing fellow, has been writing about voting rights and covering the election from a lot of hotspots over the past year. So tell me, we had two major Democratic wins on January 6th in Georgia that are really setting the stage for this next period of lawmaking. Brittany, you were there during the final weekend of campaigning. Paint a scene for us. Tell us, what did you see? You were at Democratic rallies, you were at Republican rallies, all during the pandemic. What was it like? I guess your mask was on.
Yes, my mask was definitely on at all times, but just to start off visibly, that was a major difference. You would go to Trump rallies Republican rallies. Also, there was a Trump rally in Georgia, and people were closer together, not wearing masks, or just a handful of people would be. And Democratic rallies were a little more social distance. Everyone was in a mask, as you can imagine. And that was just right off the bat. When you got to one of these places, you could see where priorities were different. And then in the speeches themselves from candidates, I heard from Kelly Loeffler and John Ossoff, in person, and Raphael Warnock. David Perdue was quarantining at that time. Another reminder of the pandemic, and also the potential voters that were there. The Democratic rallies were much more focused on a $2,000 stimulus check, healthcare, where jobs, the economic fallout from the pandemic, and also just in general for people. And at Republican rallies, I was kind of shocked to hear some of the priorities. I mean, number one was fighting for Trump, who was not even on the ballot. And number two, that I heard quite often was this liberal or progressive influence, changing how people feel. I heard, funnily enough, because I was in Atlanta, about, people from California moving to Atlanta and changing Georgia's priorities. So very, very different at those in Georgia.
And tell us, Eli, you were there too. Were you surprised that Ossoff and Warnock won? You had been there a few weeks reporting for the Prospect, kind of going all around to different, hot spots where voters were hanging out. Tell us, was it a surprise that there was a Democratic win?
I think that the political landscape is chaotic enough that nothing feels too surprising. To Brittany's point, I think what ultimately made the difference in what I saw was that these two aspects of progressive politics, broadly speaking, have been braided together in a way that I thought was ultimately going to be really compelling, which was, on the one hand, there is the Democratic Party's growing diversity. On the other, there is, to Brittany's point, this compelling economic message around improving people's material lives, which the article that I wrote for this issue, that old time Southern populism, makes the argument that this is pulling from a really old tradition in Southern politics, which is that in order to build coalitions that can be successful electorally in the South, from a progressive standpoint, you need to bring together large groups of people around a compelling vision for how you can improve their lives. And you won't see kind of any clearer example than that. Then, do you want $2,000 checks? Then vote Warnock and Ossoff, which was the closing argument that they made.
Well, I think like the point you made in this great feature you have in our new issue, which subscribe if you want to see the latest prospect, although it's all online, is that populism was the winner here. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to overdetermine it, but I do think that. Yeah. I think that the argument that they made in closing recognized that it wasn't just enough to sort of point to the bad manners of the Republican Party, but that you also had to really make a compelling case for, in the middle of a crisis that's magnify American inequality 1,000-fold, like how you plan to make people's lives less miserable, more enjoyable, more comfortable. And that $2,000 check was ultimately, I mean, it is laid all the emphasis on that in their closing argument. Not only Warnock and Ossoff, but also Joe Biden, who made an appearance the day before the election. Again, this is an argument that's in different versions been made for a really long time in the American South. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a really famous Georgian, was making the case repeatedly and relentlessly that the victories of the civil rights movement would be incomplete as long as there wasn't a dramatic reorganization of economic power in this country. Now, $2,000 checks is a little bit different than that, but it's not hard to see if you look closely that they are pulling from that tradition of saying, in order for us to live better lives, like, we have to band together and get real relief to people who are suffering.
And Brittany, I want to bring you in because you have been covering the long lines, the complications of voting by mail in many different states. What were some of the kind of issues facing voters on a kind of technical level, on a kind of how to get your vote counted level in Georgia during this runoff?
Oh yeah, that's a great question, especially considering, the history of recent elections in Georgia. We're almost expecting to see the tweets and social media posts about long lines and someone voting at 1 a.m. But what was interesting about both the general election and the runoff is Georgia really exercised all of its alternatives to in-person voting. It had obstacles because of fears about the post office, fears about my ballot not arriving in time, fears about signatures, because Georgia has a signature matching law that, maybe my signature will be tossed out or my ballot will be tossed out because of that small technicality. But what we actually saw was a huge success in using that program. To vote absentee in Georgia, you actually don't need an excuse, which a lot of other states do, especially states with those long line issues. And so Georgians were able to request their ballots. A lot of organizations on the ground, the grassroots groups, were helping people go through that process. They made good use of the ballot drop boxes for people that were afraid of the mail. And a majority of Georgian voters, I believe both in the general and the runoff, actually voted before Election Day. So on Election Day in November, their wait times across the state were about 3 minutes. And during the January runoff, which had comparable voter turnout, wait times were about 1 minute, which is the inverse of the long lines that we're kind of used to in that state.
And what did voters tell you, Brittany? What motivated people to vote early, to vote kind of with that kind of intensity that you're talking about?
Oh, yeah. There's probably a couple of different reasons, and it varies depending on whether you were turning out for the Republicans or the Democrats. I'd say right off the bat, there was so much money invested in telling people to vote in this election. Between television ads, digital ads, mailers, text messages, phone calls, you couldn't forget that there was an election in Georgia. And even in just my short time there, on the radio, ad after ad after ad while I'm driving around the state. So that right off the bat, that's number one. They were just saturated in the politics of it. On the Republican side, voters wanted to turn out, or every voter I talked to wanted to turn out to support Donald Trump. They were thinking about January 5th's election as a way to get Trump support on January 6th, which now obviously at the time we didn't know, but now we know what happened on January 6th, the voters that wanted to come out and support then President Trump. And even Kelly Loeffler, her final closing argument at the Trump rally on Monday night was, I'm going to vote to not certify the election results and support Trump, vote for me. Democrats on the other side, I think they were continuing what Eli was talking about, that organizing, that solidarity, that movement building, which obviously has a very long history in Georgia, just saying we've made a stand in November, we've seen the progress of the results of all of our work, and we're going to do it again in January.
That's great. I mean, Eli, can you give us more of a sense of Senators Ossoff, Senator Warnock? I mean, they seem to be very different parts of the Democratic Party. One's a really young guy who's tweeting about indie rock. One is kind of an elder statesman of, Black activism. And I have this image of this photo of him getting arrested, in the Capitol for protesting, I believe Medicare for all. But they really come together and they defeat, are part of this defeat of Trumpism last month. Tell us about them a little bit. What are your observations, Eli?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, I think that again, ultimately, like these elements of the Democratic Party that I think the Georgia race really nicely braided together. So they decided pretty early on in the runoff that they would run as a 1-2 punch. John Ossoff, who's a bit younger, has a background in investigative journalism. And Reverend Warnock, who represents a really long legacy of Black activism, Black clergy being deeply involved in the country's political life. One of the arguments that Ossoff made pretty repeatedly on the stump was that, look, you've got these two symbols of the Democratic Party's growing diversity. The former the reverend who occupies the former pulpit of Dr. King, along with a young Jewish investigative journalist, made for a really compelling argument that there was a forward-looking vision for how to improve people's lives when it was paired again with that populist message that we will deliver you $2,000. We will deliver you this material good that will improve your conditions. And I think again they made that decision really early on, and for competing arguments about what will happen with the progressive wing of the country or the Democratic Party, I think that this is partly an answer to what's possible when you marry that diversity with an economic message. That it really important to emphasize, to some of Brittany's point, a lot of the organizing. A lot of the electoral punch that generated was, has to thank the long-term organizers, long-term movement builders, the social movement activists who have been based in Georgia for a long time and saw this election as an opportunity, not to just elect some friendlier folks to the United States Senate, but to improve the political terrain for the fights that they know they'll have to wage after the election took place. So I think a lot of strings were pulled together here in a way that was ultimately really compelling and made the difference.
And just Brittany, in our final few minutes in this conversation about the Georgia runoff, I heard you saw a lot of, disinformation, misinformation, maybe stuff that kind of piggybacks on what we saw later that day in the kind of insurrection, this, 6 people dead at the US Capitol, unbelievable images we'll never forget. Did you see some kind of foreshadowing? Were you hearing this conspiratorial thinking that contrasts what Eli's just saying about kind of togetherness and party activism and kind of democratic populism?
Yes, I say not from every Trump or Republican supporter that I spoke to, but, it certainly came up, fears of the election being stolen. I heard a lot about Dominion voting machines. I heard a lot about ballots being found under the table, a lot of things that had already been debunked in numerous hearings within just Georgia itself. And obviously other states around the country had similar, tailored messages or videos sent out to people. And I wouldn't say foreshadowing in terms of what happened at the Capitol, because I think that was pretty unexpected in terms of the violence that happened there, at least from what I saw. But those fears were definitely there for Republican voters. And some of that is carrying through to what we're seeing now in Georgia state government. They're trying to respond to these fears that we know are, not accurate, because Georgia not only had its election, but multiple recounts and litigation. And they determined that the election was as free and fair and accurate as it could have been, as any election could be. But they're responding now with all of these new proposals to roll back access to the ballot.
Well, thank you so much, Brittany. Thank you, Eli, for your great reporting from Georgia. Thank you to our donors who helped send Eli down there. And Brittany will be shining a light on voters' rights as part of her beat on voter suppression. So thank you guys so much.
Thanks, Jonathan.
We're going to kind of shift this conversation. Thank you guys. We're going to bring in Bob Kuttner, founding editor of The Prospect, and Micah Sifry, who's written a lot about movement organizing. And we're going to talk about sort of what led to the win in Georgia, what led to Biden's victory. Bob has this just wide-ranging feature in our new issue on the movement, the party, and the president that brought Joe Biden into office. And Micah's looked at the other side of this, thinking about how President Obama was elected in 2008, the movement that brought him into office, and what happened to them. So, Micah, maybe you can start us off. Obama built this formidable grassroots operation, and you read his memoir, The Promised Land, and you kind of asked yourself, where are these guys? Where is the grassroots movement? And why doesn't President Obama kind of shout them out and give them their due? Talk us through that.
Sure. Well, I think it really is relevant to the present and how things are evolving now between Biden and the whole ecosystem around him, to remember that in 2008, in order to win the Democratic primary, Barack Obama had to build this alternative political machine to surmount Hillary Clinton's advantage, years and years in politics. And he masterfully used the internet and technology in ways that were just beginning to get mainstreamed to build this big grassroots field operation, online operation. He had 13 million email addresses. He had more than 4 million donors and something like 2 million volunteers. And a lot of us thought that's going to propel him not just to victory, but then to political success as president. And a big mystery, which I've spent a lot of time writing about in a variety of places, is why was that shut down? Why was that mothballed? And I'm not going to go over all of that now. I just went into his memoir thinking, well, okay, he's even talked about this as a political mistake in, as he was exiting the White House in 2016. Will it show up in the memoir? And the weird thing is for all his eloquence and recall, it's almost completely absent, especially once he gets into the White House. There's no mention of Organizing for America, for example, which was the vehicle that they put this army into. And it's a very strange lacuna, and it is, I think, a symptom of a couple of things. One, that for all the talk about Barack Obama as a community organizer, he was not really dedicated to organizing, and he didn't bring people with him into the White House who understood, who valued grassroots organizing. It's no coincidence that the Democratic Party shriveled in his 8 years. We lost something like 1,000 state legislative seats. And so everything that Bob writes about in his piece is, to a degree, shaped by the history of what came before. And maybe the silver lining, I'd love to hear what Bob thinks about this, is that a lot of people learned a lesson from what happened in 2008 and what didn't happen. And they're really insistent on not making those mistakes again.
Yeah, tell us, Bob, you've spoken to all of these party organizers, insiders. You've done this almost like a mapping of the different activist and advocate groups that comprise of the Democratic Party in 2020. What is your takeaway about, after all of this outreach and organizing, this very narrow victory for Joe Biden? But we need you to unmute. I'm sorry.
There's a terrific fortuitous convergence of what Micah wrote and what I wrote in the following sense. This habit of presidents wanting total control over organizers didn't start with Obama. Obama tragically had built a better grassroots operation than any previous president, and so there was more to squander. when he decided that he could not afford to allow it to have an independent existence. And so he had to bring it inside the White House, which killed it. But this, you can go back to Jimmy Carter, and for that matter, before that, to Franklin Roosevelt. But of course, in the era of Roosevelt, in the era of Lyndon Johnson, you had independent activist groups who were not beholden to the White House, who then helped Democratic presidents get elected and reelected to the extent that they had an alliance with them. But then what happens, beginning with Carter, is that as soon as the president gets elected, the president takes over the party machinery, and there's a giant sucking sound of money upwards. And small fundraising or big fundraising that had helped put that president in office just all gets commandeered by the White House, looking towards the president's reelection. And so independent organizing, even organizing that's allied with the president, gets stunted. And I think the fortuitous thing here about Biden is that, number one, because Biden kind of comes out of nowhere, doesn't have a field operation, wins the South Carolina primary really with an insider game, and had the weakest field operation at the time of his nomination of any modern nominee. And so he is more reliant than most on the rest of the progressive infrastructure. And I think he appreciates that. And secondly, you have this nice accidental convergence of Jamie Harrison being named as the new DNC chair. And Jamie, having been a red state chair in South Carolina and having been an acolyte of Howard Dean, knows how important state party building is. So there's this nice convergence. On the one hand, you have Biden's self-interest. On the other hand, you have the ascendance of people who want to put more money into grassroots party building. And even though Biden, in some respects, is the epitome of a regular, not an irregular, but a party regular, because of the circumstances in which he finds himself, he may end up being the Democratic president, the exceptional Democratic president, who's really committed to building the grassroots. That's cool. And you also have the circumstances that led to the resistance after 2016. Another piece by Theda Skocpol on that topic recently ran in the Prospect. We'll be having a symposium on that. Micah will be contributing to it. So you have this nice convergence of what's in the president's self-interest with kind of what's being built on the ground. And the question is, how do we turn that into long-term organizing resources?
And what do you think about that, Micah? How do we turn that into long-term organizing? I mean,
Well,
what lessons do you take from the organizing of America, for America example?
So there's one other piece to this story which is important, which is that Obama could not have shut down and neglected that machine, that army, if the people in that army didn't let him do it. And so the other really important point here is culture. It's what do the base, the grassroots volunteers, and there are more of them now than there were even in Obama's time. That's, we can thank Trump for one thing, which is he created a tremendous amount of volunteer anxiety and energy that is now at a scale I've never seen. So, but people have to also realize that it's up to them to demand a voice in the choices that are made about how we go forward. And the real challenge, I think, has to do with the role of big money inside the Democratic Party versus big organizing. There is a lot of money that sloshes around, and Bob's piece gets into some of this. He called it, I think, the consultant industrial complex. A lot of money that flows upward, regardless of victory or defeat. And not just money, data, the capacity to organize. It's more democratized now. And I do think that's part of the dynamic that makes Biden's life different than Obama's. Obama was this unbelievably charismatic figure. And in 2009, if you tried to criticize him as a progressive in any way, they had a whole way of like shutting you out. And so people towed the line. we don't see that now. We see a lot more diversity of voices with the capacity to organize independently. And that, and it's not just the squad. I know you were talking about that earlier, but all of that, I think, is a healthier ecosystem, but it still comes back to people themselves realizing that they cannot just put their trust in a president and his appointees to fix things. It's going to be up to us too.
And just one quick closing comment on this, if we have one more minute, do we?
Yeah, definitely. This is, 2-minute warning, but yeah.
Point one, Biden could not shut this down if he wanted to, but he doesn't want to. Point two, there's still an enormous challenge in figuring out how to get resources to the grassroots for long-term organizing. Being dependent on foundations, that's not great. Being dependent on individual rich people, that's not great. There just aren't enough dues-paying members of enough dues-paying organizations for long-term organizing to be self-sustaining. And that's really one of the issues that our online symposium is going to be focusing on. What's the nature of long-term organizing? How do you get resources to it? What kind of organizer training does it need? What kind of institutional life does it have? If you go back over 50 years and you look at which organizations, like the thousands of indivisible groups, prove durable, you can really count the ones that lasted more than a decade on the fingers of one hand, other than the labor movement and the churches. So is there some third category of freestanding grassroots organizations that can figure out how to have some durability?
Well, that's a great question. And one thing I really liked, I think, about both of your pieces, and then we have to let you go, is the lessons learned from the Republican side of the ledger. I love, Bob, this section of your piece where you go through, what the Democrats organizing can learn from the Koch brothers. And I think, Micah, you do this in a different way of how the Tea Party actually builds on everything that Obama for America was doing, but, equal but oppositely. So I thank you both for your great contributions to this issue, and both of them are available online at prospect.org. So do check them out, and Theta Scotchbowl's long dive on organizing the resistance. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Cheers.
Now we're going to bring in our writing fellow, Marcia Brown, who's been reporting on a number of things at the Prospect, but in our recent January-February issue is looking at the census. And she's going to tell us, Marcia, lay this out for us, because we had a late breaking change to your story, because from, when the issue was going to press, Biden had taken office and there were major changes in the census. Tell us about, it's a fast moving story. Can you catch us up on the census?
Yeah, so thanks for that question, Jonathan. So when the story was actually assigned, it was in November. And in December, the Census Bureau missed a really crucial deadline. The Constitution requires that the president get the census numbers to Congress by December 31st for reapportionment. And the Bureau, for a lot of different complicated reasons, missed that deadline. So that was the first big change to the story. So once they missed the deadline, there were a lot of questions up in the air. When were the numbers really going to come out? Were the numbers going to be accurate? If there's going to be an undercount, how big of an undercount would it be? And so then, of course, Joe Biden takes office. And on January 20th, he signs 2 executive orders, which reverse 2 of Trump's executive orders, which were what was so controversial and part of the administrative sort of interference that slowed down the census over the summer. So with that, I'm going to back up a little bit, actually, and start by just talking about how the census was already going to be really hard to count people because of the pandemic. So the Constitution requires that, every 10 years, the government count the number of people in the United States. And that doesn't matter if you're a citizen, but just the number of people who are living here. Of course, Trump tried to interfere with that, but the number is how many people are here on April 1st of 2020. So most of the time, the census is really trying to get folks to self-respond. So fill it out online, fill out the form online. That's the easiest way to do it. But a lot of folks don't fill it out online. They don't know how, they don't hear about it. So the Census Bureau has a field period where they go door to door. I'm sure a lot of people have seen, field workers knocking on your door, asking you to fill out the census, making sure everybody in your household is accounted for, that your neighbors are filling out the census. So all of this was a lot harder because there's a pandemic. People were afraid to open the door in case they might get COVID. Hard to count populations became even harder to count. So even before the administration was, going to interfere in the count by trying to add a citizenship question to the census, which struck fear in a lot of immigrant communities who didn't want to respond for that reason. And then later on, trying to have a separate count of undocumented people, which for a lot of other reasons was scary to immigrants. So one of the things, so anyway, so that's kind of everything that was going to happen. And the Census Bureau tried to get all of these numbers counted. They couldn't really do it in time. So even there was this litigation, and it did slow down the count, but the administration, the Bureau ultimately missed the deadline, and we're now kind of expecting those numbers in March. So that's kind of the backstory on how quickly this story was changing. It changed in December. And then soon after Joe Biden took office, the director of the Census Bureau resigned, Stephen Dillingham, and he resigned kind of a year before his term was up. He's supposed to serve for about 5 years. And he resigned over questions of rushing to complete a data set of undocumented immigrants, which a lot of people said was really bad and would be bad for these communities and put these communities in danger, and was unnecessary and was only being done for political reasons. So that's a little bit of the backstory on the census, the deadlines, the timeline, everything that happened.
And what about unhoused people? And it's hard to reach homeless people. How did that play out this time around?
Yeah, that's a great question. So like I mentioned, the pandemic made the census much harder than it normally is. But every 10 years, there are always populations that are hard to count. This year, they were even harder to count. There's always an undercount, for example, of young Black men. There's almost always an undercount of immigrants, people of color, people who don't have permanent addresses, who are homeless. And so this year that became even harder, partly because the field operation to reach those people was more difficult because of the pandemic, partly because of administrative interference on the part of the Trump administration. But there were a lot of activists who worked really hard to make sure that these communities were counted. And one of the campaigns was actually getting immigrant communities to self-respond, because immigrant communities are often fearful of a government worker knocking on their door. And so encouraging them to self-respond would ensure that there isn't a census worker knocking on the door, and having that be an issue. But one of the things that a lot of activists I spoke to, and experts I spoke to on this, talked about how important it is to understand that an undercount, especially of these hard to count populations, and especially people of color, is actually part of the administration's agenda. It's part of advancing what they said was a white supremacist agenda, because they're trying to paint a picture of the country as being whiter than it actually is. And of course, the Trump administration also tried to block a lot of immigrants from entering the country, and a lot of immigrants are people of color. So again, this was all part of that same effort.
So Marcia, before we let you go, because we're going to shift the conversation in a moment, but I'm curious to hear, there's not going to be another census for 10 years, but are there things that the Biden administration should or could or will be doing to kind of repair from this, all this damage you're talking about that the Trump administration did to the census?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I should say that the Census Bureau, there are a lot of civil servants who have worked really hard to do this right. despite the Trump administration's attempts to undercount certain populations. And there are some things that the Biden administration can do to correct for that. But a lot of the undercount is just really hard to correct for, especially now that the field operation was cut short by the Trump administration. So there are some things that just can't be fixed. And, you know, one of the reasons that it's really hard to make sure that counted populations are counted properly is that when you have an undercount, the Census Bureau, because they can't, you know, make an algorithm to come up with however many people they think are there. They use what's called administrative data, things like social security numbers, tax information. But if you're one of those hard to count, if you're in one of those hard to count groups, you might not have a social security number. You might not be filing taxes because you don't make enough money for the IRS to say you need to file taxes. So it's really hard to do that, and the administrative data isn't always there. So there are some things that the Biden administration can do, but there are some things that can't be corrected for. But I do think that the Bureau is doing their best to have a good count finished up at the end of this.
Well, thank you so much, Marcia. That's Marcia Brown, Prospect Writing Fellow, who has been covering immigration, especially for us. So it's a really interesting story that kind of melds different parts of your beat. So thanks for this great piece in our new issue, Marcia.
Thanks, Jonathan.
So now we're going to bring in Deputy Editor Gabrielle Gurley, who has been talking about a different aspect of what the Biden administration can do to repair from the Trump years, focused on the climate crisis. So Gabrielle, Biden has just rejoined the Paris Climate Accord, and you write in our new issue about wind power, something that the US just has not done a great job at. Tell us about the opportunity presented by wind, and we need you to unmute. So it's a different kind of wind power we need.
Yes, I think that wind power is ready to go. The United States is basically playing catch up on offshore wind. In the early 90s, when countries like the United Kingdom were out convincing their populations that they needed to get moving on the transition to renewable energy. The debate in the United States was more along the lines of, this is too expensive. In the states like Massachusetts, where the debate had moved on, NIMBY forces, wealthy individuals who did not want to see wind turbines from their oceanfront views held sway. So the United States has been behind for a long time, whereas countries like the United Kingdom have been out in front. They made the social bargain with ratepayers, convincing them pretty much that higher prices were good in the short term, that it was short-term pain for long-term gain. And environmental consciousness, if you will, is probably at that time was much higher than it was in the United States. So they were able to move ahead with wind installations and get people on board, move people into new job sectors in a way that the United States is just now catching up to. So where the United Kingdom has some 40 wind farms, including kind of a 1-2 punch of they're on their way to powering up the world's largest offshore wind farm. In a couple of years, that's going to be obsolete because they're going to be powering up another wind farm that's going to be even bigger. And that second one will be the world's largest. So the United States is still having somewhat of this debate. It is moving on in certain states because obviously here it's a state by state process also that you have to look at. States like Virginia and Maine have pilot projects in the water, and the mid-Atlantic states, New York, New Jersey, are also going in that direction. So it has been a fraught process for the US, but happily it is starting to move forward.
And what lessons can the Biden administration take from these UK successes in terms of the big picture, in terms of getting more renewable energy, as part of the agenda? What would you like to see in these coming weeks and months from the Biden administration?
Well, I think the big challenge for the Biden administration is simply if there's a public relations challenge, and then there's the actual getting these installations into the water. On the public relations front, I think it's safe to say that people now realize in the United States, Americans now realize that we are in a crisis, whether some people may not be sold on what the roots of that crisis are or what the causes are, but they are sold that the climate is changing, and that one way, the primary way forward is powering up these renewable sources of energy, be it solar and wind, and you see that pretty much across the board in the U.S. right now. So I think Biden can be confident that his focus on climate has popular acceptance. On the political front, it's going to be a little bit tougher sell if he can convince Congress to come along on some renewable energy goals. That would certainly help on that front, but it's going to be a case by case situation as far as states are concerned. I think the Atlantic seaboard is pretty much ready to go. The Gulf Coast, Texas, which is a big onshore wind state, is probably also looking at what can it do to transition away from oil and the oil industry that is on its coast to the renewable sector. And obviously offshore wind is the way to go on that. So I think
in our last,
pardon?
No, yeah, exactly. Sorry to interrupt you with the Zoom lag time, but in our last minute or two, Gabrielle, I mean, tell us more about, the politics is difficult, but it seems like technically it's very feasible. I mean, what is the opportunity presented by offshore wind power? I mean, what kind of transformative change could you imagine if the US were to follow the UK?
Well, I could imagine, for example, the Eastern Seaboard being powered by wind. England, for example, is in the middle of, I won't say a public campaign, but Boris Johnson has said that he wants the entire country to be powered by wind and offshore wind energy by 2030. That's absolutely an amazing goal. Could the Eastern Seaboard be powered by offshore wind? That's a question. That's a question. It certainly may not happen by 2030, but there's no reason that it can't. There are a lot of things that have to happen as far as transmission is concerned, moving that energy on shore. But it is certainly feasible that a considerable portion of the country, if you will, could be powered by offshore wind. It's just a matter of moving forward on a political front to have states embrace that move and power up, get the utilities in place, get everyone on board, and kind of present a united front.
Well, thank you, Gabrielle, deputy editor, who's leading our coverage of the climate crisis, where we're really building out and expanding at theprospect.org. So stay tuned for more coverage of climate. In this issue, she's writing on offshore wind and what the US can learn from the United Kingdom. Now I'm going to bring in Harold Meyerson, our editor at large, who wrote a really fun piece of criticism in our new issue on this film, Mank. And I wanted to ask you, Harold, this is a film about a screenwriter. And I think what you were saying to me and what you're saying in the article is that screenwriters are not that fun or interesting. There's not that many films about them. I think a lot about how films about journalism are kind of boring because the actual act of journalism is a lot of tapping at your computer and working the phones, and it looks very glamorous what appears as the product, but the actual sausage making of journalism, maybe like screenwriting, isn't that interesting. So tell us, what do we learn in this film that's about a screenwriter?
Well, there are classic movies with fictitious screenwriters in them, Sunset Boulevard, and others. But when you get to films about real screenwriters, there isn't a lot of drama there. I mean, you're typing, you're writing, you're wadding. The height of drama is you wad up your piece of paper and throw it away. Well, okay, that doesn't sustain a 2-hour movie. The only film before Mank that I can remember about a real screenwriter was Trumbo, about Dalton Trumbo, but that was really about a larger theme. Trumbo was one of the Hollywood 10 who went to jail for defying Congress, asking him questions about his membership in the Communist Party. He was blacklisted under an assumed name. He wrote many terrific scripts, and then was allowed finally to use his own name starting in 1960. So a film about Trumbo was really about a larger issue. It was about the McCarthyism and how it impacted both the film industry and the country, seen through the prism of what the Trumbo family had to go through. Mank is about a very celebrated, since Pauline Kael wrote about him in 1970, a very celebrated writer who in his early days in Hollywood produced some Marx Brothers movies, which are great, but then had fallen into kind of alcoholic disuse by the studios until a young Orson Welles approached him and he said, let's work on a picture about William Randolph Hearst. And of course that became Citizen Kane. Mankiewicz had to battle Welles to get credit for his script. He eventually got it, won an Oscar for it. But that in itself isn't like Trumbo. There's no like larger issue there. And what redeems even movies about journalism is there's a larger issue there, with the most prominent such movie being All the President's Men or Spotlight. There's a larger social issue. No larger social issue in the Mankiewicz story. So,
and tell us, I mean, I love the headline that Mank is fake news about fake news. I mean, what can we learn from this being a kind of trumped up story in general, especially as you're doing our daily coverage of the impeachment trial and kind of weighing in every night or early in the morning on, an insurrection that was born of fake news?
Yes, I was watching it until I came on with this podcast right now. The element that the filmmakers added was that Mankiewicz was really seeking revenge against William Randolph Hearst and the studios for concocting fake newsreels that led to the defeat of Upton Sinclair in 1934, when he was running for governor of California and leading. Sinclair had proclaimed himself for decades as a socialist, but he decided, like Bernie Sanders, to run in the Democratic Party. And he won the Democratic nomination. And to keep him from winning, the studios and Hearst's newspapers and the non-Hearst newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, made up stories about dangerous Sinclair supporters coming into the state. And millions of Californians going to the movies would see these fake newsreels, which were presented as real newsreels, which had been filmed at by MGM, of actors personifying dangerous Sinclair supporters who would undermine the state. And presumably, what was inserted as pure fiction into the movie, it's the fake news that David Fincher and his father, who wrote the screenplay, added to the story of Mankiewicz, was that he had inadvertently given the idea for this to MGM production executives, and that he then moved heaven and earth to stop it from happening. A friend of his, who never really existed, committed suicide because of this, and this was his revenge on them. Now, this script was written 20 years ago. And it took that long to find a studio, Netflix, which is sort of now become the film producer of last resort and first resort, before Netflix, funded it and put it into production. And the irony here is that this problem of fake news, which 20 years ago no one was particularly concerned about, or even the phenomenon of socialists in the Democratic Party, which 20 years ago no one, Bernie Sanders was a very obscure figure 20 years ago. At the time the film actually got released, which was exactly 1 month and 1 day after last November's election, at which time Donald Trump and his folks were doing everything they could to say this was phony, and that was, a deluge of fake news. That's when the film was released. And so if ever a film was made timely kind of by accident, it's Mank. It raises all kinds of political issues and social issues that are germane today for reasons which could not have been apparent 20 years ago.
So Harold, before we let you go watch the impeachment trial and continue covering it, and we're going to bring in our editor, Dayen, to talk about some questions from our readers, what are you looking for today, Harold, in the impeachment trial? I mean, you've been covering it minute by minute.
Well, what's
your target?
The new theme today is that if Trump is not convicted, he will continue to go down this path, and he will continue essentially to excite violence in the American political system. Today, it's being, the idea of a guilty verdict is being put forth as kind of a prophylactic, and they're outlining what right-wing extremist groups emboldened by what they did on January 6th are doing, are planning. They're saying, do you really want to maintain the fences and the National Guard surrounding our nation's capital and many state capitals indefinitely going forward? So they're kind of putting this forward as sort of a prophylactic that finding Trump guilty, as they should, really would make a difference going forward in the immediate and long-term future of American democracy.
Great. Well, tune in to the prospect.org for Harold's daily coverage. Sign up for his newsletter on tap, where he sounds off 2 times a week on the news. So thank you so much, Harold.
Thank you, Jonathan.
All right, David, we are in our final segment. David Dayen, editor of the Prospect. We have questions from our donors. I'm gonna put them to you. Here's a fun one. What are you optimistic about and pessimistic about regarding the Biden administration? But you have to unmute. I'm sorry.
I'm unmuted now. Hello, everyone. That's interesting. I wrote today, actually, about what I considered to be Bidenomics. This concept that we're, not going to use the same kind of recovery strategies from a recession and crisis that we have in the past, which has led to the upper echelon, upper income earners grabbing almost all of the income gains from the recovery. We're going to, in the parlance, run the economy hot. We're going to use accommodative monetary policy. We're going to use very strong, expansive fiscal policy, and we're going to attempt to get full employment. I mean, that is a real sea change from how we have managed the economy over the last 40 years. What I'm pessimistic about is that it's not all about the macroeconomy. There are other challenges that we're going to be facing that require a public policy response. And so far, the jury is out on where the Biden administration is going to go on those policy responses. So if you read the First 100 newsletter that I do every morning here, you can get a fuller treatment of that.
And what about, this is a more topical question, and you've obviously been writing a lot about the GameStop kind of debacle. What do you think the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau should be doing about Robinhood?
Well, I don't know that Robinhood is necessarily a CFPB problem as much as it is a Securities and Exchange Commission problem. I think the problem with the Robinhood app is the allowance of major leverage in terms of options trading that is at the fingertips of investors that really don't know the power of leverage and what problems can arise from that. But the larger problem is not about Robinhood. The larger problem is about over speculation in our economy more generally, and over financialization is such that people who are sitting at home right now think that the way to build wealth is through a trading app rather than established systems that can put people up the ladder of mobility, which has been sawed off in recent years. So I think that's sort of the larger issue that resonates. I mean, there is a tremendous amount of over speculation in our financial markets. I've written about that with respect to Bitcoin and what Elon Musk is doing with respect to these particular new Wall Street instruments known as SPACs, which I don't want to explain right now, but there's a lot going on here, and I think that the SEC needs to look at our financial markets with an eye toward removing the unproductive trading that has dominated Wall Street over the last several decades.
In what role, someone else wants to know about what agencies, play a role in this kind of regulation. You just talked about the SEC. What about Treasury under Janet Yellen? I mean, what role? I understand that she was a very lucratively paid speaker, Citadel, which owns Robinhood and kind of presents perhaps some conflicts of interest.
Yes.
What do you think about that? And what
Citadel
role
doesn't own Citadel does not own Robinhood. It manages its trading through an arrangement known as payment for order flow, where the trades are routed through Citadel, which has sort of a storehouse of securities available to make the trades, a market maker. Yellen's position is unique because there's this oversight body called the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which has sort of been disused over the Trump era. But the Treasury Secretary is the chair of that. And it's basically a super regulator. It's all of these systemic risk regulators throughout the economy. And they're supposed to manage and look for problems within the financial system. Now, are they going to think that this excessive trading in one particular stock over the course of a week represents a systemic risk to the financial system? Probably not. But should they see the speculative output, the fact that we've had more of these blank check companies in the first 3 weeks of 2021 than in all of 2019, the fact that Elon Musk can make a tweet and make somebody a billionaire in a joke cryptocurrency. I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which this is starting to look a lot like the 20s, the 1920s, not the 2020s. It's very frothy, and there are a lot of unregulated corners of these markets, and that's exactly what the FSOC is supposed to look for. So it'll be interesting to see where Yellen takes that.
Well, thank you so much, David. Sign up for David's kind of pop-up newsletter, the First 100, where he's covering each and every day of the Biden administration. And then he's going to get a break after that because he's been newslettering for a year straight. Although you can always tune into prospect.org, where David's reporting widely on how the Biden administration is handling the first days and weeks. And thank you to everyone who's watching at home. Subscribe to get a copy of this beautiful issue, which we're just incredibly proud of. We're grateful to our fact checkers, to our business side, Stephen Whiteside and Ellen Meany, and the person who's hiding behind that cover, Anna Greisbord, who has made this incredible event happen. So Thank you everyone for tuning in. Subscribe, donate, or just read. We're at prospect.org, and we'd love to hear from you. Send us a note. I'm Jonathan Geyer, managing editor. This is David Dayen. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks.